We live in an age where political thinking has become increasingly tribal. Americans retreat into ideological camps, consuming only information that confirms their pre-existing beliefs, treating political opponents as enemies rather than fellow citizens with different perspectives. This tribalization of politics represents one of the gravest threats to democratic discourse I've observed in decades of analyzing political systems. But there is a way to think politically without surrendering to tribal impulses, a way that preserves both intellectual integrity and democratic engagement. The key lies in cultivating what I call engaged spectatorship, the ability to participate in political life while maintaining analytical distance from partisan passions. When I wrote The Opium of the Intellectuals, I warned against the seductive power of ideological thinking among the educated classes. Today's tribal politics represents a popularization of that same intellectual disease, spreading far beyond academic circles into the general population. The stakes couldn't be higher. Democracy itself depends on citizens capable of reasoning together about common problems. Today, I want to share with you the intellectual tools that can help you navigate our polarized landscape without losing either your principles or your capacity for rational judgment. These are not abstract philosophical exercises but practical skills essential for democratic citizenship in an era of information warfare and emotional manipulation. Chapter 1: The Seductive Trap of Political Tribalism. Political tribalism offers something deeply appealing to the human psyche: the comfort of certainty, the warmth of belonging, and the simplifying power of clear enemies and allies. When we join a political tribe, we gain instant access to ready-made opinions on complex issues, a community of like-minded individuals, and the psychological satisfaction of viewing ourselves as part of a righteous cause fighting against obvious evil. This tribal membership feels intellectually efficient. Why struggle with ambiguous evidence when your team has already sorted through the complexity for you? But this efficiency comes at an enormous cost to our capacity for independent thought. Tribal political thinking transforms citizens into mere soldiers in an ideological army, following orders rather than analyzing evidence. I've watched this process unfold throughout my career, from the communist intellectuals who subordinated all analysis to party doctrine, to contemporary Americans who filter every new piece of information through partisan frameworks that predetermine their conclusions. The most dangerous aspect of political tribalism isn't its potential for violence, though that remains real, but its corruption of the intellectual faculties necessary for democratic citizenship. When we think tribally, we cease to evaluate arguments based on their merit and instead judge them based on their source. A policy proposal becomes good or bad not because of its likely consequences, but because it comes from our tribe or theirs. Evidence becomes ammunition rather than information, selected not for its accuracy but for its utility in tribal warfare. This degradation of political reasoning creates a vicious cycle. As tribal thinking spreads, the quality of public debate deteriorates, driving moderate voices from the conversation and leaving the field to tribal warriors who profit from perpetual conflict. Citizens lose faith in the possibility of reasoned discourse, further entrenching themselves in tribal identities that promise psychological security in an increasingly chaotic information environment. The psychological appeal of tribalism extends beyond simple group belonging. It provides what psychologists call cognitive closure, the satisfying feeling that complex questions have been definitively answered. Tribal thinking offers clear moral categories. We are good, they are evil, our policies work, theirs fail, our motives are pure, theirs are corrupt. This moral simplicity feels intellectually robust but represents a profound abandonment of the nuanced thinking that complex political questions actually require. Modern technology amplifies these tribal dynamics through algorithmic filtering that ensures we encounter primarily information that confirms our existing beliefs. Social media platforms profit from engagement, and nothing engages like outrage. The result is an information ecosystem that systematically rewards tribal thinking while punishing intellectual nuance. Citizens find themselves trapped in echo chambers that feel like the entire world but represent only narrow slices of human opinion and experience. Breaking free from these tribal dynamics requires understanding their psychological power. Tribalism isn't simply intellectual laziness, it fulfills genuine human needs for belonging, purpose, and moral clarity. Any alternative approach to political thinking must acknowledge these needs while channeling them in more constructive directions that serve both individual flourishing and democratic governance. Chapter 2: The Intellectual Prerequisites for Non-Tribal Political Thinking. Breaking free from tribal political thinking requires cultivating specific intellectual habits that modern society conspires to undermine. The first and most crucial habit is what I call methodological doubt, the systematic questioning of your own assumptions and those of your preferred political community. This doesn't mean embracing skepticism about everything, but rather maintaining a healthy suspicion of conclusions that align too perfectly with your psychological preferences or group loyalties. Methodological doubt requires distinguishing between what you know through careful analysis and what you believe because it feels right or because trusted authorities assert it. Most of our political beliefs fall into the second category, inherited from family, friends, media, or academic environments rather than derived from independent investigation. There's nothing wrong with trusting credible sources, but intellectual honesty demands acknowledging the difference between inherited beliefs and examined convictions. The second prerequisite is developing comfort with intellectual uncertainty. Tribal thinking thrives on the illusion of certainty, the belief that complex social and political questions have clear, obvious answers that only bias or stupidity could lead someone to reject. But honest political analysis reveals that most important questions involve trade-offs, unintended consequences, and competing values that resist simple resolution. Learning to think well politically means learning to live with ambiguity while still making necessary practical decisions. This tolerance for uncertainty extends to our understanding of political opponents. Tribal thinking requires viewing opponents as either stupid or evil. How else could they reject obvious truths? But empirical observation reveals that intelligent, well-intentioned people often reach different conclusions when analyzing the same evidence. These differences frequently reflect genuinely competing values or different assessments of complex empirical questions rather than cognitive deficiency or moral corruption. The third prerequisite is what I call temporal perspective, the ability to evaluate political phenomena across longer time horizons than the immediate news cycle or electoral calendar. Tribal political thinking operates in perpetual emergency mode, treating every development as either a catastrophic threat or a decisive victory. But most political changes unfold gradually, and their long-term consequences often differ dramatically from their immediate effects. Historical perspective reveals patterns that contemporary tribal warfare obscures. Policies that appear revolutionary often represent variations on persistent themes. Crises that seem unprecedented usually echo earlier challenges. Solutions that promise transformation frequently reproduce familiar problems in new forms. This historical awareness doesn't lead to cynicism but rather to a more realistic understanding of what political action can and cannot accomplish. The fourth prerequisite involves developing what philosophers call epistemic humility, the recognition that our knowledge is always partial and provisional. This humility doesn't paralyze decision-making but rather encourages the kind of careful, evidence-based reasoning that improves the quality of political judgments over time. Epistemic humility means being willing to change your mind when new evidence emerges, admitting when you don't know enough to form confident opinions, and recognizing that reasonable people can disagree about important questions. Finally, non-tribal political thinking requires cultivating emotional regulation, the ability to engage with political questions without being overwhelmed by anger, fear, or tribal loyalty. Emotions play important roles in political life, motivating action and signaling values, but they become destructive when they override rational analysis. Learning to feel strongly about political issues while thinking clearly about them represents one of the most challenging but essential skills for democratic citizenship. Chapter 3: Distinguishing between principles and positions. One of the most effective tools for escaping tribal political thinking involves learning to distinguish clearly between underlying principles and specific policy positions. Tribal thinking conflates these levels, treating particular positions as sacred and anyone who questions them as enemies of fundamental values. But intellectually honest political thinking recognizes that people who share basic principles can reasonably disagree about how to implement them in practice. Consider the principle of equality. Almost all Americans affirm some version of this value, but they disagree dramatically about what equality means and how to achieve it. Some emphasize equality of opportunity, others equality of outcome, some focus on procedural fairness, others on substantive results. These disagreements don't necessarily reflect different fundamental values but rather different theories about how complex social systems actually work and what interventions produce desired outcomes. When we focus on principles rather than positions, we create space for productive political dialogue. Instead of debating whether specific policies are good or evil, we can examine whether they effectively serve shared values and what trade-offs they involve. This shift moves conversation from tribal warfare to collaborative problem-solving, even when participants ultimately reach different conclusions. The principle-position distinction also helps us maintain consistency across changing circumstances. Tribal thinking adapts principles to serve immediate political needs. What matters isn't the underlying value but whether a particular position helps or hurts the tribe. But genuine principles provide stable guidance for evaluating new situations, even when their application produces politically inconvenient conclusions. Take the principle of individual liberty, which most Americans claim to support. But liberty conflicts with other values like security, equality, and community welfare. How we balance these competing principles in specific contexts requires practical wisdom that goes far beyond tribal loyalty. A person genuinely committed to liberty might support drug decriminalization while opposing hate speech restrictions, or vice versa, depending on their analysis of how different policies actually affect human freedom in practice. The same complexity appears in economic policy, where shared commitments to prosperity and fairness generate radically different positions depending on one's understanding of how markets, governments, and social institutions actually function. Some believe that reducing inequality requires extensive government intervention. Others argue that such intervention undermines the economic growth that ultimately benefits everyone. Both positions can reflect genuine concern for human welfare combined with different empirical assumptions about social causation. I invite you to examine your own political beliefs through this lens. Select 3 positions you hold strongly and identify the underlying principles they supposedly serve. Then honestly assess whether those principles might, under different circumstances or with different empirical assumptions, support different positions. This exercise isn't designed to undermine your convictions but to clarify what aspects of your political thinking reflect deep values versus tribal loyalties. This analytical approach requires intellectual humility, the recognition that your current understanding might be incomplete or incorrect. But this humility doesn't lead to relativism. Instead, it opens space for learning and adaptation that ultimately strengthens your capacity for sound political judgment. When we understand why we believe what we believe, we become capable of updating our beliefs as circumstances change while maintaining commitment to fundamental principles that transcend particular political battles. The distinction between principles and positions also illuminates why political coalitions often seem strange from tribal perspectives. People who agree about specific policies may hold those positions for entirely different reasons, while people who disagree about policies may share deeper commitments that could support future cooperation. Understanding these underlying dynamics creates possibilities for political alliances that transcend traditional tribal boundaries. Chapter 4: the empirical discipline, facts before narrative. Tribal political thinking operates primarily through narrative rather than empirical analysis. Each tribe maintains a preferred story about how the world works, what forces shape social outcomes, and why their opponents act as they do. These narratives provide psychological comfort and group identity, but they often diverge significantly from observable reality. Learning to think politically without tribal distortion requires developing what I call empirical discipline, the habit of checking narrative claims against available evidence. Empirical discipline begins with recognizing the difference between correlation and causation. Tribal political narratives excel at identifying patterns that support their preferred explanations while ignoring alternative possibilities. If social outcomes deteriorate after implementing policies the tribe opposes, tribal thinking attributes the deterioration to those policies without considering other potential causes. If outcomes improve after implementing favored policies, tribal thinking credits the policies without examining whether improvement might have occurred anyway. Sound political thinking requires more careful analysis. What does the best available evidence suggest about the relationship between specific policies and observed outcomes? How do we account for confounding variables, time lags, and measurement problems? What do natural experiments and comparative cases tell us about policy effectiveness? These questions don't always yield definitive answers, but they prevent us from accepting convenient explanations simply because they support our preferred narratives. Empirical discipline also involves understanding the limitations of available data. Political tribes often treat statistics as weapons rather than information, selecting favorable numbers while ignoring context, methodology, or alternative measures. But honest political analysis requires acknowledging what we don't know as clearly as what we do know. Many crucial political questions involve complex social phenomena that resist precise measurement. And intellectual honesty demands acknowledging this uncertainty rather than pretending to possess knowledge we lack. Consider how differently tribal and empirical approaches handle inconvenient evidence. When confronted with data that challenges preferred narratives, tribal thinking employs various defense mechanisms, attacking the source, questioning methodology, emphasizing different time periods, or simply ignoring problematic information. Empirical discipline, by contrast, treats inconvenient evidence as valuable information that might require revising our understanding. This empirical approach extends to evaluating the claims of political leaders and media sources. Instead of accepting assertions because they come from trusted tribal authorities, empirical discipline asks, what evidence supports this claim? What alternative explanations might account for the same phenomena? How confident can we be in the data underlying this argument? What interests might bias this source's presentation of information? The discipline becomes particularly important when evaluating policy proposals. Tribal thinking supports policies because they align with group identity or because they appear to punish tribal enemies. Empirical discipline asks different questions. What problem is this policy supposed to solve? What evidence suggests that this approach will be effective? What unintended consequences might emerge? How have similar policies performed in other contexts? What would count as evidence that the policy is working or failing? This analytical approach requires developing comfort with complexity and ambiguity. Most social phenomena result from multiple causes interacting in ways that resist simple explanation. Economic growth, crime rates, educational outcomes, health indicators, all reflect complex interactions between individual choices, institutional arrangements, cultural factors, and environmental conditions. Empirical discipline means acknowledging this complexity rather than pretending that simple policy changes can solve complex social problems. The empirical approach also demands intellectual patience. While tribal thinking generates immediate emotional satisfaction through clear moral judgments, empirical analysis often requires suspending judgment until sufficient evidence accumulates. This patience doesn't lead to paralysis, We often must make decisions with incomplete information, but it does encourage the kind of careful reasoning that improves decision quality over time. Developing empirical discipline requires practice and commitment. Start by identifying claims from your preferred political sources and investigating the evidence behind them. Seek out high-quality empirical research on political questions that interest you. Learn to distinguish between rigorous social science and advocacy masquerading as research. Most importantly, develop the habit of asking, "How do we know this?" whenever you encounter political claims that seem too convenient or too alarming to be true. Chapter 5: The Practice of Intellectual Independence in Political Engagement. Intellectual independence doesn't require political disengagement, quite the opposite. Democracy needs citizens who combine analytical rigor with active participation, who bring empirical discipline and principled reasoning to public debate. But practicing intellectual independence in political contexts requires specific strategies for maintaining analytical distance while remaining effectively engaged. The first strategy involves diversifying your information sources beyond your natural ideological comfort zone. This doesn't mean treating all sources as equally credible, but rather ensuring that you regularly encounter high-quality arguments and evidence from perspectives that challenge your assumptions. Read the best representatives of viewpoints you initially reject, not to convert to their position but to understand why intelligent people reach different conclusions. This intellectual diversification serves multiple purposes. It prevents the echo chamber effects that reinforce tribal thinking, exposes you to evidence and arguments you might otherwise miss, and helps you understand the genuine concerns that motivate political opponents. Most importantly, it strengthens your own positions by forcing you to defend them against the strongest possible objections rather than weak strawman versions of opposing views. Intellectual independence also requires resisting the pressure to have immediate opinions on every political development. Tribal thinking demands instant reactions that demonstrate loyalty and generate emotional satisfaction. But sound political judgment often requires patience, allowing time to gather information, consider alternative interpretations, and think through implications before reaching conclusions. When you do form political opinions, practice what I call provisional commitment, holding your views firmly enough to act on them while remaining open to revision based on new evidence or better arguments. This stance allows effective political participation without the intellectual rigidity that characterizes tribal thinking. You can vote, donate, volunteer, and advocate while maintaining the intellectual humility that enables learning and adaptation. Engage in political conversation differently. Instead of seeking to win debates or convert opponents, approach political discussion as collaborative inquiry into complex questions. Ask genuine questions about others' reasoning, acknowledge valid points even when you disagree with overall conclusions, and admit uncertainty when you lack sufficient knowledge to form confident judgments. This conversational approach requires developing specific communication skills. Learn to distinguish between a person's position and their underlying concerns. You might disagree with someone's preferred policy while sharing their deeper values. Practice steel-manning rather than straw-manning, presenting opponents' arguments in their strongest form rather than their weakest. Acknowledge the trade-offs and uncertainties involved in your own positions rather than presenting them as obviously correct solutions to complex problems. Intellectual independence also means taking responsibility for your own political education. Don't rely solely on partisan media, social media feeds, or conversations with like-minded friends to understand political issues. Seek out primary sources, academic research, historical context, and international comparisons. Develop the habit of checking claims that seem too convenient or alarming, and learning to distinguish between reliable and unreliable sources of information. This self-education requires developing what I call intellectual courage, the willingness to encounter ideas and evidence that might force you to revise comfortable beliefs. It means reading books that challenge your assumptions, engaging with arguments you find initially repugnant, and acknowledging when your previous positions were based on insufficient information or flawed reasoning. Practice intellectual independence in your political actions as well as your thinking. Vote based on your best judgment about candidates and issues rather than straight party loyalty. Support organizations and causes based on their effectiveness rather than their tribal affiliation. Speak up when you disagree with positions taken by your preferred political community, and give credit to good ideas regardless of their source. This approach to political engagement may initially feel less satisfying than tribal participation. You won't experience the emotional rush of righteous certainty or the social bonding that comes from sharing enemies with like-minded allies. But you'll gain something more valuable: the capacity for sound political judgment that serves both your own interests and democratic governance. The goal isn't political neutrality. Democracy requires citizens to make choices and take stands. The goal is ensuring that your political engagement reflects intellectual virtues rather than tribal impulses, that your contributions to public debate elevate rather than degrade the quality of democratic discourse. Chapter 6: Learning from International Examples of Non-Tribal Democracy. Examining how other democratic societies handle political diversity provides valuable perspective on American tribal dynamics. Many established democracies have developed institutional and cultural mechanisms that encourage cross-cutting political identities and reduce tribal polarization. These international examples offer lessons for Americans seeking to practice non-tribal political thinking. Consider the multi-party systems common in European democracies, where coalition governments require parties with different ideological orientations to collaborate in governance. This institutional arrangement creates incentives for political leaders to develop working relationships across ideological divides and to seek compromise solutions rather than total victory. Citizens in these systems often maintain more complex political identities, supporting parties that align with their views on some issues while disagreeing on others. Germany's post-war political culture exemplifies this approach. The country's proportional representation system typically requires coalition governments, forcing parties to negotiate and compromise. German political discourse emphasizes consensus building and gradual policy development over dramatic ideological shifts. While Germans certainly disagree about important issues, their political culture maintains space for reasoned debate and principled compromise that American observers often find remarkable. Switzerland's consociational democracy provides an even more striking example. The country's federal council includes representatives from multiple parties, requiring cooperation between political opponents in the executive branch itself. Swiss political culture emphasizes consensus building and gradual change over ideological conflict and dramatic shifts. Citizens regularly vote on specific policy questions through referenda, creating incentives for detailed policy analysis rather than tribal loyalty. While Switzerland's unique history and cultural homogeneity limit the direct applicability of their model, their experience demonstrates that alternative approaches to democratic governance are possible. Several Nordic countries have maintained relatively low levels of political polarization despite facing similar social and economic challenges as more polarized democracies. Their political cultures emphasize pragmatic problem-solving over ideological purity, and their citizens generally maintain higher trust in democratic institutions and political opponents. These societies invest heavily in civic education that emphasizes democratic values and critical thinking skills rather than particular political positions. Denmark's approach to political discourse offers particularly relevant lessons. Danish political culture values hygge, a concept that includes respectful social interaction and avoiding unnecessary conflict. This cultural norm extends to political discussion, where citizens expect politicians and commentators to engage respectfully with opposing viewpoints. Danish media tends to present multiple perspectives on controversial issues rather than adopting partisan positions, and citizens generally consume diverse sources of political information. Canada offers particularly relevant lessons for Americans, given similarities in federal structure, cultural diversity, and economic development. While Canada certainly experiences political divisions, Canadian political discourse generally maintains more civil tone and greater acceptance of legitimate political opposition. Canadian political parties appeal to overlapping constituencies, reducing the tribal segregation that characterizes American politics. The Westminster parliamentary system used in Canada, Britain, and other Commonwealth countries creates different incentives than the American presidential system. Parliamentary systems require governing parties to maintain majority support in legislature, encouraging broader coalitions and more centrist positions. The tradition of loyal opposition legitimizes political disagreement while maintaining commitment to democratic institutions. These international examples don't suggest that other countries have solved the problem of political disagreement. Healthy democracies require robust debate about important issues. Rather, they demonstrate that political conflict can occur within institutional and cultural frameworks that preserve space for reasoned dialogue and principled compromise. Americans seeking to practice non-tribal political thinking can learn from these alternative models while adapting their insights to American conditions. The key insight from these international examples is that democratic culture matters as much as democratic institutions. Countries with similar constitutional arrangements can develop very different approaches to political discourse depending on cultural norms, educational practices, media structures, and civic traditions. While Americans cannot simply import foreign political cultures, they can learn from successful examples of how democratic societies manage political diversity without descending into tribal warfare. Understanding these alternatives also reveals that current American political polarization isn't inevitable or permanent. Political cultures can change, and citizens committed to non-tribal political thinking can contribute to that change through their own examples of reasoned engagement with political questions. Chapter 7: Building Democratic Character Through Intellectual Virtue. The ultimate goal of non-tribal political thinking isn't merely to improve the quality of public debate, though that would be valuable enough. The deeper purpose is to cultivate what I call democratic character, the intellectual and moral virtues that enable citizens to participate effectively in self-governance while preserving the freedoms and institutions that make democracy possible. Democratic character begins with intellectual humility, the recognition that political questions are often more complex than they initially appear and that reasonable people can disagree about important issues without being stupid or evil. This humility doesn't paralyze decision-making but rather encourages the careful consideration and open-minded dialogue that improve the quality of collective choices. Closely related is intellectual curiosity, the desire to understand different perspectives and to learn from new evidence rather than merely defending existing beliefs. Citizens with genuine intellectual curiosity approach political disagreement as an opportunity for learning rather than a threat to their identity. They ask questions like, "What might I be missing? What valid concerns underlie positions I initially reject? How might changing circumstances require adapting current policies?" Democratic character also requires moral courage, the willingness to take unpopular positions when evidence and principle demand it, and to acknowledge errors when experience proves your previous judgments wrong. Tribal political thinking rewards loyalty over accuracy, but democratic governance requires citizens willing to prioritize truth over tribal solidarity. This moral courage manifests in various ways: defending unpopular truths, admitting when you've changed your mind, giving credit to good ideas regardless of their source, and criticizing your own political community when it strays from its stated principles. Such courage doesn't mean being contrarian for its own sake, but rather maintaining commitment to truth and principle even when doing so creates social or political costs. Perhaps most importantly, democratic character involves what classical philosophers called prudence or practical wisdom, the ability to make sound judgments about particular situations while keeping larger principles in view. Prudence recognizes that abstract principles must be applied thoughtfully to concrete circumstances, that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes, and that unintended consequences often matter more than original motivations. Practical wisdom requires developing what I call institutional imagination, the ability to think through how policies will actually work within existing institutional and cultural contexts. Many political failures result from implementing theoretically sound ideas without sufficient attention to how they interact with existing incentives, power structures, and social dynamics. Citizens with democratic character learn to think institutionally as well as ideologically. Democratic character also involves emotional regulation, the capacity to feel strongly about political issues while maintaining rational judgment. Strong emotions like anger, fear, and hope play important roles in political life, motivating action and signaling values. But these emotions become destructive when they override careful analysis or justify treating political opponents as enemies rather than fellow citizens. This emotional regulation doesn't mean becoming dispassionate about politics. Rather, it means learning to channel political emotions in constructive directions that serve democratic values. Instead of letting anger at political opponents drive you toward demonization, use that anger to motivate careful analysis of what's actually wrong and how it might be fixed. Instead of letting fear of political changes paralyze rational thought, use that fear to motivate serious engagement with the challenges facing democratic institutions. These virtues aren't innate, they must be cultivated through practice and reflection. Every political conversation, every policy debate, every electoral choice provides an opportunity to strengthen democratic character. When you encounter political disagreement, you can choose to respond tribally, seeking ammunition to defeat opponents, or democratically, seeking understanding that might improve collective judgment. The cultivation of democratic character requires daily practice in small matters as much as heroic stands on major issues. How you respond to political posts on social media, how you engage with neighbors who disagree with your politics, how you evaluate news stories and political claims, all these mundane interactions provide opportunities to practice the intellectual virtues that sustain democratic life. Educational institutions play crucial roles in developing democratic character, but they cannot do so simply by teaching particular political positions. Instead, they must cultivate habits of critical thinking, empirical analysis, respectful dialogue, and intellectual humility that enables citizens to engage productively with political questions regardless of their particular ideological orientations. The stakes of this choice extend far beyond individual satisfaction. Democracy depends on citizens capable of governing themselves wisely, and self-governance requires the intellectual virtues that tribal thinking systematically undermines. If enough citizens practice non-tribal political thinking, democratic institutions can function as designed. If tribal thinking continues to spread, those same institutions may preserve the forms of democracy while losing its substance. Conclusion. The path away from tribal political thinking isn't easy, but it's essential for preserving both intellectual integrity and democratic governance. By distinguishing principles from positions, maintaining empirical discipline, practicing intellectual independence, and cultivating democratic virtues, we can participate effectively in political life without surrendering our capacity for independent judgment. The goal isn't to eliminate political disagreement. Healthy democracy requires robust debate about important issues. The goal is to ensure that our political engagement reflects the intellectual virtues necessary for sound collective decision-making. When I observe contemporary American politics, I see both the urgent need for such thinking and the enormous obstacles that prevent it. Social media algorithms reward tribal thinking, political institutions incentivize polarization, and cultural pressures discourage the kind of intellectual independence that democracy requires. Yet I also see citizens hungry for alternatives to tribal warfare, seeking ways to engage politically that honor both their convictions and their commitment to democratic values. The choice facing each citizen is clear: you can allow tribal impulses to guide your political thinking, gaining the psychological satisfactions of certainty and belonging while contributing to democratic dysfunction. Or you can choose the more difficult path of intellectual independence, accepting uncertainty and complexity while contributing to the kind of reasoned discourse that enables democratic societies to address their common challenges wisely. Democracy asks much of its citizens, but it offers something invaluable in return: the opportunity to shape our common life through reasoned dialogue rather than force. That opportunity is worth defending, and defending it begins with how we choose to think. The future of democratic governance may well depend on whether enough citizens prove capable of the intellectual virtues that make self-governance possible.